Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today on the second webinar in our summer webinar series on building resilient and sustainable communities in Ireland. My name is Aoife Corcoran, and I'm a Senior Staff Officer here at the Housing Agency, working in the area of sustainable communities. I'm joined today by my colleague Mary Coffey, who's running the back end of the webinar, and by our speaker today, Roland Karthaus from Matter Architecture. Before we start, I would just like to draw your attention to three things. First of all, we have a questions and answers button at the bottom of your screens. If you have any questions, we would ask that you use the Q&A function. The Q&A feature provides you with an option to post anonymously, so you can post your comments anonymously. If you just want to make some comments, please use the chat function. We've had some requests to share who our webinar participants are. However, for various reasons, we can't do this. But if you'd like to share who you are on the webinar, please do so in the chat feature. Finally, just be aware that this session is being recorded and it will be made available on the Housing Agency YouTube channel later in the week. The slides will also be made available. The agenda for today's webinar is as follows. I will give a very short introduction to the Housing Agency in the webinar series. Roland Karthaus will then present his work on intergenerational housing and will discuss how it can contribute to town and village renewal. We will then have a questions and answer session where we would encourage you to participate and ask any relevant questions you may have. If we can't answer your questions today as part of the webinar, we'll make every effort to do so at a later stage. So the Housing Agency, who is hosting this series, is a state agency based on Upper Mount Street in Dublin. The Housing Agency works with and supports local authorities, approved housing bodies, the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, the private sector in the delivery of housing and housing services. Our vision is to enable everyone to live in good quality, affordable homes in sustainable communities. It is the Housing Agency's vision for achieving sustainable communities which has inspired this webinar series. The aim of the webinar series is to contribute to and stimulate discussion on resilience and sustainability topics which are relevant for housing in Ireland, to raise awareness of the importance of building resilient and sustainable communities in the light of local, national and global shocks to the system, and to create opportunities for collaboration and future projects. This webinar series explores 4 topics which is relevant for housing: nature-based solutions for housing developments, green spaces in urban places, taking a collaborative approach to retrofitting, which we talked about last week, and intergenerational housing and regeneration. On that note, I would like to introduce you to Roland Karthaus. Roland is an architect and co-founder of Matter Architecture, a practice working across all scales, types and geographies of projects. He also teaches at the University of East London and has developed a strong reputation for award-winning research in health and well-being in the environment. He is a member of the RIBA Planning Advisory Group, a design council built environment expert, and sits on several design and quality review panels. And in 2018, he won the RIBA President's Award for Research in Ethics and Sustainability. Roland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aoife. Thanks to you and Mary and to the Housing Agency for inviting me to speak today. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoy the discussion. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Maybe Aoife, you can just nod if everything looks okay. Okay, thank you. Life is about human relationships, and that doesn't change with age. This is a quote from Bob, Britain's oldest person, age 111. And it captures what lies at the heart of my talk. I'm a director at Matter Architecture, and I'm going to give a brief overview of our recent research project, Rethinking Intergenerational Housing. What I want to explore with you is why intergenerational living isn't the norm anymore, why that's important, what architecture has to do with it, and why we need to rethink the words we use to describe all of this, keeping in mind Bob's simple truth. Our research work is all published on a website in a way that's easy to explore. So if you're interested by my talk, please go to the web address and engage with it further. It's matterarchitecture.uk/intergen. As an architect, I design buildings for people, and I've never really understood why it is that when we design buildings, we have to separate them by age. These are two images of our project. One is a housing project for older people, and the other is a nursery. In the images here, everyone is aging, and yet when we talk about aging, we tend to mean older people. But aging is a journey that we all go on and we all experience. This diagram is taken from a report about older people's housing options called Happy, and it shows the spectrum of residential care that's available to people in the UK. As people's needs change, they have to move into housing, often with greater levels of care. But each time they move, it's detrimental to their health and their life expectancy. And more recently, funding cuts have also meant that people can't always afford to move along this spectrum. And that's illustrated by these people falling between the gaps. As these gaps widen, people are increasingly ending up more quickly in nursing homes and hospices and hospitals. Why is it organised like this? And why can't people live long lives in homes that they can age in? I think this is a fundamental question for us. For decades, architects in the UK have been following a policy of mixed use. The idea is that if you combine different uses and people together, then they'll mix, and that mixing will have social benefits, they'll help each other out, and it'll support community cohesion and so on. The reality is that that rarely happens, and certainly in my experience as an architect, it's actually very rare that co-locating uses together actually results in mixed communities. It does happen sometimes, but I think it's the exception rather than the rule. And co-location isn't sufficient to ensure this kind of community cohesion and mixing that is aimed for. Within families, mixing between generations is of course very common, and it's something that everyone values, and it's known to have preventative health and lifelong benefits for everyone. This is my son and my late grandmother in the garden of her care home, and all of us benefited so much from each other's company, regardless of our ages. So why can't we live like that? And why does that only really happen consistently amongst and within families? After all, people are just people, and everyone has something to give and to gain from each other's company. Maybe it sounds a little bit idealistic, and of course, living together isn't for everyone, but it is becoming increasingly clear from the rise of loneliness, isolation, and the huge impacts on people's health that these have, that we actually need this as a serious option for housing, and especially for those who don't have family living nearby. As society has urbanized and we've moved into cities, we've gained great independence and mobility, but we've also lost some of these traditional family ties that have helped to support each other across society and ages. So at the risk of making a sweeping generalization, the extended family way of life is something that has existed for thousands of years around the world, and there are many different architectural forms that have been designed to accommodate it. Often revolving around a shared space, such as in a courtyard, traditional forms of housing have often evolved around courtyard spaces. In this arrangement, people of different ages can share skills and help each other out so that the family as a whole can thrive and can achieve more than the individuals could on their own. Within the family, things that would normally be paid for outside of the family are shared without exchange of money in a different kind of economy. And within a family, the idea of generations is clear cut. There are clearly defined generations. But in wider society, there aren't distinct generations. The choice of which generation you're in is an arbitrary one. There are just people of different ages, and everybody is aging. So our question is, can a similar way of life work for people who might not be related? And is it helpful at all to think about generations? People make a lot of assumptions about what people can and can't do based on their age, and increasingly they're not true. Lots of people are physically fit and healthy well into their older ages, whereas others may need help when they're much younger. The point is that people have different needs and things to offer, And that has less to do with age than you might think. Another part of this question is how can you generate a community in which people can give and benefit from it without it merely becoming transactional? By that I mean I described the exchange of services that can take place within a family, and if that happens outside of the family, then how can it be on a similar basis, that it isn't simply I give something and I get something straightforwardly in exchange, because that isn't really how communities are built. And in some of the schemes that we looked at in our research, some of them are organized in that way, and it doesn't actually seem to work that well, because it loses the kind of magic of the more diffuse community support that comes from a community of common interest. So the term intergenerational carries a lot of these connotations, and I think that that may be part of the issue as to why it's difficult to implement. So looking at some of these examples, there are lots of examples of intergenerational schemes all around the world. In our research, we looked at them systematically to try to understand how they're organized and what their pros and cons might be. You can find all this on the website, and there's a bit more detail in there. Each of the examples we looked at in terms of the way that they're organized and the way that the accommodation is configured to support that organization. We also put them into sort of loose categories or typical ways that the schemes are organized, because there are different approaches. But all of them have a few things in common. First of all, they're not really strategic or policy based. By and large, they've emerged in response to specific circumstances and often have happened through what we call grassroots initiatives or local innovation. And for this reason, they're very inventive, but it makes them more difficult to replicate in different circumstances. Secondly, and to a greater or lesser degree, they all tend to reinforce the distinction between generations because they tend to be organized in cohorts by age. So to take one example from these that are on the screen here, Humanitas in the Netherlands, which you may have heard of, it's quite a well-known one. Like many other schemes, it's a care home for older people that houses younger people for free, and in exchange, they spend time with the older people. Now, there's nothing wrong with this as a principle, and it's very clearly has a lot of benefits for both groups that are involved. But if we're trying to think about how to break down barriers between ages in wider society, then setting up schemes that are organized around people grouped by age and their assumptions about what needs and offer goes with those age groups, that doesn't seem the right way to go about it. As I said, these schemes are genuinely innovative. So our question is not what's wrong with them. The question is if there could be a more strategic version that generates this kind of sharing across all ages without reinforcing age boundaries, what might that look like? We think the answer lies in a design process based on a theory of change model for social benefit. What we're aiming for through these schemes are the social benefits that arise from this way of living. And we know from these examples what these benefits can be. They're things like preventative health benefits, and there are many more that we've identified on our website. So if we take those on the left-hand side of this diagram here and make them the goal of the design work, these social impacts, as they're otherwise known, they're quite broad outcomes. So we need some intermediate goals or short and medium term outcomes that we can work towards. So these are shown in the middle of the diagram here. These are things that are known to contribute to those longer term goals, such as spending time being socially and physically active with others, which we know has preventative health benefits. There are also things that we can more directly design for. And so finally, then on the right-hand side, we think about the specific activities that will lead to these short and medium-term outcomes. For example, a gardening club in a mixed-age housing scheme will support people being socially and physically active, and that will have preventative health benefits for all involved. And then lastly, at the bottom here, to make sure that we're getting this right over time and so that we can learn better what works and what doesn't, we need an ongoing evaluation mechanism. These schemes are new, and it's a new way of thinking about things, and so there aren't necessarily lots of existing evidence to draw on. So we need to be generating evidence as we go, and we need to be able to adjust what we're doing to better align it to where we're trying to get to. So the diagram is showing sort of time in reverse. It's starting at the furthest away future and thinking forwards to now as to what things we should be doing in order to get towards that future position. And these activities can act then as a kind of brief for an architectural design process. So this social benefit approach to design is crucial, but it's still only one part of the jigsaw. It's how we set the brief for the project, but the design of the scheme, shown here on the left-hand bottom corner of the diagram, is also crucial because it has to deliver on that brief. It has to allow and support those and enable those activities to happen. And then because these activities happen over time as people are living in their homes, so over long periods of time, and those benefits are only going to be realized if the activities continue to take place, then the way the housing is looked after and managed is crucial. And that needs to be considered at the same time as the other two aspects, shown as item 3, management, in the bottom right-hand corner of this diagram. Now, to many of you, this may all seem very obvious, but in my career as an architect, again, it's another thing that I've very rarely seen happen well. Usually I'm only involved in one area of this process, and I don't have the opportunity to help join these things up. And so part of the impetus for doing this research project was to be able to step outside the usual boundaries of the remit of a project, of an architecture project, and to be able to think about what the right conditions are to set up a good brief and a good ongoing process that can achieve a lot more. So I'm skipping over a lot of details here, and you can follow the logic more step by step on the website. But meanwhile, we're now thinking about how this type of housing might be configured to fit with its brief, and how it might plug into its local context. We think this connection with its local community is crucial to making social benefit a reality. Social benefits are things that are quite widely dispersed, and there has to be this, as I say, this kind of mutual community of interest, and that really works best at the community and neighbourhood scale. So a new housing scheme should gain from its local community, but it also should be seen as a wider community asset. So it should contribute to and gain from its neighbourhood, and the project should be designed in such a way as to enable that. Now, this principle applies equally to high density town centre contexts as it does to rural situations. And the opportunities and needs of each of these situations are likely to be very different, even though the principles remain the same. In rural circumstances, the potential to combine with employment uses may be crucial in attracting working age people, and public or smart transport links will be crucial to connecting in with that wider community. Whereas in a higher density situation, often land values tend to squeeze out the kind of community assets and spaces that a scheme like this needs to incorporate anyway, and so it can offer a lot to its wider context. We've set out on the website some key design principles which are in an interactive way, so you can explore them. I'm only going to touch on a couple of these here. There are 5 key categories as we see it: the location, the building configuration, the configuration of the homes themselves, the shared spaces, and the design for management. Now, all of these things are important characteristics in any housing scheme, but they're particularly crucial, we think, in making intergenerational housing work, and the way that they're scaled and configured is particularly important. So shared spaces are one of the key points. Most housing schemes have shared spaces, but from our research, we found that there are 3 key types of shared space that serve different, related, complementary and crucial purposes. The first is a public-facing space, and this diagram is obviously non-site specific. It's intended to be generic, and obviously the character and scale of each of these will be different in every circumstance. But we've called the public space a public room, and the idea is that it's the space that really connects in with its local neighbourhood, providing a facility for local people and providing a kind of interface between the housing and the neighbouring community. The second space is some sort of shared garden or courtyard or communal space for all the residents of a scheme, and it's where it acts as a kind of resource, and it's an important health and well-being resource. Lots of housing schemes have spaces like this, and what we've found is that very often they don't really support that smaller, intimate groups of people who want to get together over a cup of tea to discuss maybe more personal needs and more in a more kind of intimate way. That can feel very difficult in a communal space because you're very much in public view. And so a third category of space is this breakout space, which are scaled to act in that way. And they can be very low maintenance, outdoor type spaces, can even be balconies. But the important thing is that they're neutral. They're not looked after by one individual. The website shows some examples of each of these spaces as we found them differently in other projects, and some of the important characteristics of each of these. So thinking back to our social benefit logic diagram, the main objective that we're trying to work towards in this type of housing is the sharing of activities between residents. The existing examples that we looked at have different ways of trying to make this happen. And some of them make it a contractual obligation. So in some schemes, it's part of your tenancy agreement that you will spend a minimum amount of time with other residents undertaking activities, and in exchange, you'll have a subsidized rent. And that's this very transactional relationship that I've been talking about. In most of these, that doesn't seem to work very well. It's very difficult to make it sustainable because something that, that is obligatory removes the kind of magic that goes with it being voluntary and something that you want to do and are motivated to do through your own initiative. The difficulty with voluntary schemes, of course, is that people start out with good intentions, but over time those tend to get lost. People are busy, have busy lives and have other calls on their time. So how do we find a balance between those things? And there's no simple answer to that, but we think that a crucial part of that is about how the housing is organised and managed. And we've been looking at tenant and resident management organisation models to see how practical aspects of the running of a housing scheme can be given over to the residents as areas of responsibility. And that serves two functions. It helps to ensure that the residents are engaged with the day-to-day running of the scheme, but it also acts as an icebreaker. So it forces people to come together to solve practical problems. And the intention then is that people can go on to do other things that they might want to do that might be more fun together in a more voluntary capacity. And the idea underpinning all of this is one of co-design. And the idea that any scheme, the way that it's organized, the way that it's run, is always going to be much more successful and sustainable if it can be developed together with its residents. And ideally, that also applies to the design of the housing. For it to be integrated into its community, it should be designed together with its community. That isn't always easy, and it needs a lot of resource. It's something that has to be invested in the outset. This also extends to the viability of the scheme, by which I mean the economic sustainability of it. I think one of the biggest obstacles to intergenerational housing is the ongoing cost of running it. And so we've been looking at how the spaces, the management and the support can be both very light and also can be overlapped with revenue generating functions that also have community value. So if they're facilities that are both needed and funded in the local community, then that self-reinforcing positive relationship is generated. And of course, there's a question in the current moment about how this might happen post-COVID. In the UK, there's been a terrible crisis in care homes, and approximately half of all of the COVID deaths have been experienced in care homes. And I think although care homes provide a really important component within that housing spectrum, it does clearly show that simply segregating older people into institutional environments is not inherently safer. We think that physical distancing may still be needed in local communities, and the local community groups that have sprung up across the country shows that physical distancing has, if anything, strengthened social closeness in a time of crisis. And there's been a lot of discussion about relationship capital, which is something that we think that we can build on coming out of this crisis. And if that means that the shared spaces that we're designing need more space, then that's a good thing. And all of this recent period really underlines to me the greater need for alternative ways of living as we come out of this crisis. So back to our friend Bob, and if life is about human relationships, then our question should be, how do we design for human relationships? I would argue that business as usual was taking us in the wrong direction, and we have a unique opportunity at the moment to do things differently. We need to start at the start, and we need a more holistic approach to designing for social value. We're currently working with 2 London boroughs, Camden and Ealing, on different approaches to this and to try and make it happen as pilot schemes in London. And we're also exploring that with other housing providers across the country. Thank you for listening, and please do explore our interactive resource at matterarchitecture.uk/intergen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Roland. Very interesting presentation on intergenerational housing. We have quite a number of questions coming in here first. So I think a couple of questions coming in on what you just discussed there on how do you think COVID will impact on shared behaviour. So is this a model that will work going forward for places in rural towns and in villages as a way of regenerating them, or do you think COVID will put a stop to this type of idea of shared spaces and shared places to live?
Yeah, as I said, I think that it mustn't put a stop to it. I think that in the physical distancing, the phenomenon of social isolation that we were already experiencing pre-COVID is at great risk of getting a lot worse. But at least my experience in London has been that remarkably, as I say, the social networks and local community networks that have sprung up in response have almost gone in the opposite direction, and in spite of physical distancing have generated new communities of social relationships. And I think social relationships, there's an important role for technology. I mean, I'm speaking to you now, and I probably wouldn't have been, before COVID, because all of this has made a virtual interaction so much easier. But in the end, human relationships are about face-to-face relationships. I think that it's very unclear. There hasn't been enough evidence, as I understand it, about what the right physical distance needs to be between people to prevent transmission of viruses and so on. We know that we haven't been getting it right because, like I say, the crisis in care homes in the UK has been appalling. So business as usual isn't the answer. I think that we're seeing lots of local authorities are taking initiatives to give over much more of our roads to public realm, for improving cycling and walking, and just a greater generosity of public and shared spaces. So I think all of that is a good thing, and I think it's something that we're going to value a lot more as we go forward. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I would say.
Well, we have a similar issue with the care homes here in Ireland, so we totally understand. So just a couple of questions here. I suppose we're very interested in how the intergenerational model might work in kind of a town setting or a village setting, and how this could be used to regenerate these places that are kind of lacking both in younger people and then I suppose housing for older people. And there's a question coming here that says, is there an opportunity to move this forward in the repurposing of unused kind of high street retail in small towns and cities post-COVID? So how realistic is or can you see this working in a street, in a town in Ireland that's, got high vacancy? Are those types of buildings suitable, or are we talking about a new development in a town, or, how do you see this working best?
Yeah, I think, so I think that's a really pertinent question, and it's something that we're looking at. I do quite a lot of work with high streets, and obviously, the way the economy is going to be as we come out of this is going to be a massive challenge for high streets. I think that the regenerative potential of housing that is fundamentally about shared and mixed spaces has a fantastic opportunity to step into that space and provide a kind of a different form from the pure retail. I mean, again, I think before COVID, we already knew that high streets were too reliant on a kind of, some more than others, but a monoculture of pure retail rather than mixed use. And I think this is a great opportunity to step into that space and broaden what high streets are about. I think the tricky bit is, of course, that retail spaces work really well as that kind of public room that I described, where it's both a facility and a commercial enterprise that's both inward and outward facing and is kind of public interaction and all the rest. But obviously, in themselves, they don't make good housing spaces, and so it's opportunities where there's housing above shops, I think, is a great opportunity. Now, it's something we've been looking at in a bit of detail, because one of the barriers to the leasing of flats above shops has often been the complexity of interaction between the leasing of the retail space and the housing. And that's because the retail has been always primary. If the high street is under economic threat, then I think there's going to be a big motivation to rethink all of that and to think about new models of combined leasing and so on that could really release that as an opportunity. So I think that's a definite area for study. And as I said, I mean, a key principle is that it's got to be seen as an asset, and a regenerative asset is definitely part of that. But that also means some investment, of course. And I think like I said, I think the upfront investment is always the tricky bit, but it has to be put into the context of longer term social value. And there are new funding models emerging, new social impact funding models and so on that are sort of stepping into that area.
Yeah, definitely. So we have a question here, Roland, and it's about, like, can you give a little bit more information about how you engage with communities and with management and future residents? Like, so kind of a bit what we were kind of saying, like, I suppose, how do you maybe encourage future residents to take up living in an intergenerational setting, or how do you engage a community, say in England or in Wales or Scotland or Ireland, to take on or even consider intergenerational housing as an option?
Yeah, so I think this is a really double-edged sword, to be honest, because like I was sort of hinting at in my talk, I think the term intergenerational means different things to different people, and it carries quite a lot of baggage with it. So there is a sort of negative side to it, that some people see it as meaning essentially young people providing care on the cheap for older people. And I think, the fundamental problem is that what we're trying to address is generational divides, and they're abstract things. They don't really exist. We're all aging, and age is a continuum. So as soon as we start talking about generations helping each other out, we're already making the same mistakes that have led to that problem in the first place. There's a famous, I think it's a misattribute, but there's a sort of well-known quote supposedly by Albert Einstein that you don't fix problems using the same thinking that created them. And I think that the terminology that we use is really important. One of the things that we were exploring with Camden was how we could attract younger working age people to take part in an intergenerational housing project. They have a cohort of key workers, and they have a key worker housing arm, and they were looking to integrate that into an intergenerational housing project. And we all agreed that the word intergenerational was likely to be a barrier for these younger people to want to engage with it. They need to see it as a positive life choice rather than as a bit of volunteering work. And I think we didn't quite solve that problem. We never came up with a snappy title that would grasp everyone's attention. But I think it's probably different in every case. But I think mainly it's about taking part in your local community. And I think at the moment there's a resurgence of interest in local community initiatives. And I think that kind of grounding in the local community is key to it all.
Yeah, and do you think maybe for the next generation that magic of community support could be rebuilt in towns and villages, maybe with intergenerational housing? Like, I love that term, magic of community support. I think we've all felt it over the last kind of number of months living in different communities. Like, so do you think that's kind of something that the next generation will experience or could experience in this sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think they will have to by necessity, because this generation, not the generation, but the people kind of graduating now and entering the workforce now are doing so at a time when, opportunities have never looked more difficult, I think. And so I think the necessity will be to rethink how we organise ourselves and to gain support from each other, regardless of all backgrounds and ages in local areas. So I think that it's got to be that's got to be a good way forward.
Great. We've got a question here from somebody that's actually living in a rural setting in Ireland. The question is, we service 2 small villages. We have little services except great rural transport link, but all our elderly tend to move to nursing homes in bigger villages or towns when they get older, as there's no independent living option. The question is, are there economies of scale that would preclude small developments like this? And how interested are councils in at looking at this type of development aligned with rural regeneration? So there's a couple of questions there. I suppose it's, can this be done on a smaller scale in a smaller town or village? And then how interested do you think councils are in kind of working on these types of development or including them in regeneration projects? Yeah,
lots of interesting points in there. I mean, I think that sounds really promising, because certainly in the UK, the biggest barrier to this kind of thing taking place in rural centres is public transport. There's such poor quality, and the public transport that there is in rural areas is really expensive. It's really unaffordable. So if there are good, affordable public transport links, I'd say that's the most important thing. And then for sure, the smaller the scale, the more difficulty there is in supporting and maintaining those shared spaces. But I think that everything can be proportionate, and the very smallest kind of additional facility in the context of a lack of facilities is the most highly valued. Our experience certainly here is that local authorities are actually the most interested in this, because so we spent a lot of time engaging with housing providers, both commercial and registered providers, as we call them, what used to be housing associations. They're all really interested in it, but none of them are responsible for dealing with the things that don't work. So the consequences of people falling between the gaps in terms of health and social care don't end up at the doorstep of housing providers. They end up at the doorstep of local authorities. So they're the ones that have to carry the burden of it, and they are the ones that see the preventative benefits, the benefits of taking preventative action, essentially. So I think it's for that reason that we've had the most progress with those. Of course, there's great opportunities for local authorities to partner with housing providers and with commercial providers and so on. And I think that kind of network at a smaller scale is maybe the way to support rural communities in a sustainable way. But local authorities here in rural areas are as interested and engaged with this as those in London. It just happens that we're working with 2 in London, but we're also having discussions in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire in quite rural areas.
And we're hoping that we will have some discussions in Ireland as well, because we think it's definitely something that could work here. We have another question in there about the importance of building in management of shared spaces is pointed out by yourself, and the success of any shared public space is good management. How can this be built into the design and procurement stage to guarantee community participation and engagement? That's a big question.
Yeah, so there's a kind of fundamental principle that I'm sort of really strong advocate of co-design, and I think that people slightly misunderstand sometimes the role of involving people in an engaged way in a design process. People aren't necessarily experts in design, and that's not why we involve them. We're not trying to get them to do the design work for us. But people are experts in their everyday lives and how they use space. And it's that if we can capture that knowledge and that engagement in the earliest stage, then every scheme is going to work better. It's going to be it's going to generate a sense of stewardship, and that's about it kind of lasting in the long term. I mean, I think the lesson from the kind of large-scale housing estates that we have a lot in the UK, the sort of modernist approach, wasn't that there was anything necessarily wrong with the design. It was just that they were designed around a very top-down servicing model that meant that all services were provided to people, and people didn't have a lot of say in how they were organised. And I think that's the real reason why a lot of those housing estates haven't turned out to be all that sustainable. It's a kind of software and hardware thing where you can't design the hardware unless you know the software that's going to run on it, and the software programmers need to be involved in the hardware design, I think. But I think the thing to say about that is that people also underestimate the amount of resource that's needed to do co-design properly. I've been involved, I've been commissioned on projects where we've been asked to do co-design process from the start, but the commissioning clients haven't acknowledged the level of resource that's needed to do that well. And as a result, then it doesn't work, and people become quite negative about it. It does cost more, but that investment pays for itself many times over in the longer term. It's all about taking the slightly longer term view. Okay.
We have another question in there is, what role do you see government playing in designing for social value?
Ooh, interesting question. I think the government is playing lots of roles in it, but they're quite often antagonistic. So I think they're often pulling in different directions. I think there isn't more generally a very strong and broad understanding of what social value and benefit is, how you invest in it, why it matters, and how you gain the benefits of it in the longer term. I think the problem is we've become too obsessed with trying to measure things, and in the narrow way that we tend to measure these things, social value isn't easily measurable. That's not to say it can't be measured and valued in other ways. And I think local authorities, as I say, because they're responsible for all of these areas, are getting quite sophisticated at this. And as I said, there are other funders stepping into this space, social impact funders. I think for a long time, there was a lot of interest in the sort of payment by results model, which was also promoted by the government. And I think we've seen a lot of examples where that just hasn't worked, because it's too reliant on trying to measure things that can't be measured. So to give a specific example, the government redesigned the whole prison probation service in this country around a payment by results model. It really didn't work at all, and they're now reviewing the whole basis of that model. So I think that, to me, that's not the right route. The route is more about this. It's a kind of what in local authorities called proxy savings. So they're able to identify areas where they know that they'll make savings. They can't necessarily account for it in an auditable way that would be required for if they were actually spending money. But because in the end they have enough evidence that in the long term it will generate those benefits, and because they're responsible for their own budgets, they're able to take those views. And I think that kind of slightly broader understanding of social value is the way forward. And that's the basis of the diagrams that I showed in my talk, and there's some more diagrams giving a little bit more illustration in the online resource.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Just a question here is, what advice would you give to those listening who would be interested in establishing an intergenerational project in a town or a village in Ireland? So I know a lot of people here, you know, they're looking for practical advice on what to do and how do we start, or who do we talk to?
Yeah, big question. I think I think so. If you go on the website, there's a little bit more of the logic is kind of spelled out there. It's all illustrative because obviously the website is you know, it's intended to be understood by everybody and applicable to all circumstances, and every circumstance is going to be different. But what's set out there is a kind of process, and what's very important, you know, the key point in it is to get that briefing bit, that three-pronged diagram, to take that seriously, to be able to treat each of those with equal weight in the process, to be clear about what the social benefits you're trying to achieve are, to have clarity about how you're going to work towards those, to have a process that understands how it will be managed in the future without it being inflexible. And that's a really key balance. Like, you want to design for the management of it, but at the same time, if you design it based on too narrow a model and things change, then it won't work. And I often think of the example of, it's like a bit like the difference between Apple and Microsoft, that, you know, Apple designs everything together, and that's all fine as long as you don't want to do anything different from what Apple want you to do. But as soon as you want to do something different, then it's a problem. The reverse of that, Microsoft and Windows, is that almost that the design of the hardware doesn't think about the software, and then very often it just doesn't work. And what you need is something that somehow manages to be more open source, but be more iterative between the way that it will work and the way that it's physically designed. I don't think architects have been great at that. I think that architects have generally been, you know, too willing to accept a fixed brief and then just work to that. We used to have principles of long life, loose fit, low cost, and I think those are still good principles to apply to a scheme. I'd be very happy to talk to anyone who wants to discuss it a bit further. Well,
we've got lots of questions. I've got about 15 or 16 questions here that I haven't got around to asking yet, so I know there's a huge amount of interest in this topic. Just one final question there I'll pick from the list is, just we have a question in what policy and design supports are needed at a local authority level to deliver this model of housing? So I know a lot of people might be here from AHBs, or they might be from like different housing associations, but you know, and there's a lot here from the local authority as well. So what do they need kind of at that level to support a housing model?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I'm not familiar enough with the planning context in Ireland. I mean, in the UK, one of the really complicating areas is the different types of residential planning use class that we have. So C2 and C3 refer to ordinary residential and extra care or semi-institutional housing. And they're intertwined with the requirements to provide affordable housing, which means that they become very contested things in planning policy. And so people really focus on that when that's not really the issue. So I think, but at the same time, that complexity has been exploited by developers for quite cynical gain in some cases. So I think obviously to be wary of people, people using the kind of intergenerational badge as a means to do business as usual with another label on it. That's always a risk. But at the same time, I think a lot of it's about being able to develop a common language where everybody's understanding what it is you're trying to achieve, and joining up the sort of political with the technical, so that there's a shared vision about what it's for. I mean, that's what we found in Camden and Ealing, is that there's a kind of both local authorities are clear from top to bottom that they have a common purpose to try to address these issues. And I think that's key to it, rather than about it shouldn't. It's not really about technical policy constraints, I don't think.
It's about everyone kind of buying into the same vision of what we need.
Yeah, and a key part to that has to be the joining up of capital commissioning with revenue service provision. And a lot of the work that we've been doing with local authorities is, even within local authorities, the capital, meaning the construction delivery sides of the council are not always as joined up as they could be with the service provision sides. And it really comes down to this kind of management, design for management thing. It's also designed for service provision. And even just having a conversation where people are using the same terminology and understanding that those words mean the same things, that can take a bit of time to get that right. I think it's really important to make sure everybody's on the same page at the outset. And it does take a little bit of work, but then it pays off. It's
definitely. Well, okay, Roland, I have got another at least 16 questions there for you to left unanswered. Apologies to anyone whose questions I haven't asked.
You're welcome to, Aoife, if you want to pass them on. I'm happy to send some further responses if that's helpful.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So anyone that wants to email them in to myself, I'll pass them on to Roland and we'll make sure they're answered. There's a couple of notes there saying that we've got a lot of like-minded people on here today and we should try get a discussion going again, which I will try to facilitate. And a couple of people saying they're missing out on the coffee afterwards and the discussion. So apologies that there's no coffee afterwards and the discussion. I'd like, from the Housing Agency, to thank Roland for his time. I'd like to thank Mary Coffee, that's on our back end. And I would like to thank you all for listening, participating, and hopefully we can see an example of intergenerational housing in our towns and villages in Ireland into the near future. Okay, thank you all, and goodbye. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.